There's a fantastic scene in the HBO series Rome that really sets a nice tone for learning about the Treaty of Versailles. In the scene, Julius Caesar has just had his downfall and he's gone from the scene, and a second triumvirate has come to power, and they're trying to decide, how do we divide responsibilities amongst ourselves? So I don't know how historically accurate this scene is or whether or not this actually happened so dramatically, but Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus are sitting in a room next to a map. Octavian says, okay, how are we going to divide things up? How are we going to run the show here? Mark Antony grabs his sword, walks up to the map, and basically just starts carving it up. He carves out a piece for Rome in the west. He gives that to Octavian. He carves out a piece for Egypt, and he gives that to himself. And he carves out a piece for North Africa, and he gives it to Lepidus. And there's this great moment where Lepidus says, whoa, hold on a second here. Rome is a complicated machine, and you got to deal with all these different types of peoples, and it's a globalized society now, and you can't just chop up a map like cabbage and hand it out. There's going to be consequences. And of course, Mark Antony basically just looks at him and starts laughing and pretty much says, watch me. We're going to carve up the map and then figure out the details of how everything's going to work and the administration and the bureaucracy and all that stuff. We'll figure that out later. At the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, this seemed to be more or less the attitude of the Allied powers. They were going to dictate terms, and the rest of the world was going to have to deal with it. By the end of 1918 and heading into 1919, obviously the fighting, as we talked about last time, was over. The final tally was absolutely horrifying, with 9.5 million soldiers at least dead, 15 million wounded, 9 million prisoners of war, maybe as many as 6 million civilian deaths. And you have to try your best to imagine each one of those individually. That was kind of the point of the whole World War I series I'm doing, where each one of these deaths seemed to be more horrible than the one before it. Just from a sheer human loss standpoint, you have to consider all of the families who lost loved ones, and the spouses and the children who lost fathers. And it truly did change a generation, the way these people were decimated by the war. In addition to the human cost, you also have to look at all of the global issues that were left unsolved or even caused by World War I. By the end of the war, Russia was embroiled in a civil war that would kill millions of people, leading to the rise of the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union, and obviously the horrors of the Soviet Union. Central Europe was a mess of territorial squabbles, nationalism, and instability. And the 1919 Treaty of Versailles must be included in any analysis of the war. Yes, the fighting would be over in 1918, but the results of the Treaty of Versailles would set all of the world down a path of possibly even worse destruction coming in the future. So let's get into the Treaty of Versailles a little bit. It was dominated by three main factions. You had Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. These, of course, were the three main Allied powers in the war, and it's important to note that they dictated the terms here at the Treaty of Versailles. There was very little negotiation. In fact, for the most part, there was none at all. Germany and Russia were completely excluded during the treaty process, and in addition, when the League of Nations was created after the Treaty of Versailles, Germany and Russia were excluded. For all the high-minded rhetoric of Woodrow Wilson, who was promising a fair and lasting peace in a world that was safe for democracy and self-determination and all of these ideas that come from his 14 points, don't you kind of have to have Germany there? Don't you at least want them there witnessing what's going on if you're going to create a fair peace? But regardless, the factions that were there were broken down into a couple different camps. Britain was relatively happy with the way the war ended, at least at the moment. They were in control of the Middle East. The German naval threat was gone. Belgium had been restored. But there was also popular support for punishing Germany. After 4 years of horror, somebody had to be blamed. And this sounded great to Clemenceau and the French, who wanted to dismantle Germany, or at least disable them. There was actually legitimate talk of attempting to divide it up into separate entities. It seems that the French were most interested in punishing the Germans. Meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson was prattling about open covenants between nations, making the world safe for democracy, self-determination, having individual countries and peoples having the right to their own governments. And it's strange because none of that was happening. Much like that HBO scene, Britain, France, Italy, even Japan were carving up the map of the world with almost no regard for the people living in the territories it might affect. And of course, many of these different ethnic groups and peoples all across the globe felt betrayed. Many historians think that Woodrow Wilson did a poor job of negotiating here during the Treaty of Versailles. He had a little personality quirk where anybody who disagreed with him or anyone who questioned him became immediately pro-German. He always seemed to be convinced of his moral superiority, and you can see examples of this with the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act of 1918, where disagreement with policy from Wilson might get you in jail. So over the course of the negotiations, Woodrow Wilson would virtually abandon his 14 points in favor of going along with Britain and France more towards a policy of punishing Germany. Meanwhile, Italy was annoyed by this whole process, and they felt that they should have more of a say, and they should be getting more territory and stuff from the Allies, which they weren't getting. They were as powerful as they had been since the end of the Roman Empire, and they felt like they had no need for Britain and France to tell them what to do. So some historians trace the path being cleared for Mussolini all the way back to World War I. Japan ended the war in possession of a lot of Germany's Pacific colonies, and with an eye on the Asian mainland and China. They were disillusioned with the way the Treaty of Versailles was going. They were disillusioned with the future of the League of Nations, which, of course, they would famously walk out of. And they were on the path towards disaster for everyone in the Pacific, as we learn in World War II. Turkey and Greece were unhappy with the way the Balkans got distributed. They would be squabbling violently for a few years after the treaty. Significantly, the British and the French would carve up the Middle East, mainly based on that Sykes-Picot Agreement where they agreed to divide the Middle East amongst themselves. Just as an example here, they created a country of Iraq that included Kurdish, Sunni, Shia, different groups, ethnicities, religion, and just kind of throw them together to form the country. So much for self-determination, right? Imagine this going on in all the areas of the Middle East. Britain would get Palestine, notably, and it all sets the stage for a lot of the discord and the major issues that we have in the Middle East today. While the politicians were arguing and squabbling over issues like this, it's important to note that the blockade of Germany by the Allied powers was left in place. With the war over and the fighting over and Germany virtually surrendered, this seemed a pointless cause of death for hundreds of thousands of people. It's estimated that about 250,000 people, many of them children, would die due to starvation or disease just in this period after the war and before the Treaty of Versailles was signed. Herbert Hoover, much maligned as a president, was in charge of a group trying to get food to the German people. He was constantly bugging Wilson to send over food, and he was denied. I think it's worth pausing here just to get a feel for, if you were a German civilian, you might be a little upset by what's going on with this Treaty of Versailles. Another big thing is paying for the war effort. So the Allies spent billions of dollars trying to pay for the war, and the idea to solve this problem became German reparations, or Germany paying money to Britain and France mostly. So the idea was that because Britain and France borrowed so much money from the United States, in order to pay back that money, they would take it from Germany. This included stuff for paying for the war, military pensions, the cost of the war itself, the families of veterans, etc. Germany had to acknowledge that it was solely and entirely responsible for starting World War I and for all the events of World War I. This was known as the War Guilt Clause, and politicians like Hitler would use this to drum up support and prey on people's anger and fear with the way World War I ended. There was to be no union of Austria and Germany, so after the war, Austria was pretty decimated, and many people in Austria wanted to be united with Germany, and the Treaty of Versailles did not let this happen. So again, so much for self-determination, and this is another thing that Hitler would use to his advantage before World War II. Germany's army was to be limited to just 100,000 troops. Taken as a whole, you can read through all of the Treaty of Versailles and you wonder what happened to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. These aren't 14 points, these are a 14-point how-to guide to start World War II. The German delegation, once they were eventually allowed to come sign the treaty, summed it up as, quote, "Germany renounces its existence," end quote. Maybe the ultimate symbol of the Treaty of Versailles was that the German delegation, once it went to sign the treaty from the Weimar government, they were eventually allowed to come sign the treaty, but they were held behind barbed wire before they could review and accept the terms, not allowed to contact anyone else. Another mistake by the Allies was dealing entirely with the Weimar government and not with the German military, not having maybe them come sign as well or some factor related to that. This would leave the door open for claims that the army never surrendered and that Germany had been stabbed in the back by Weimar politicians. Yet another good excuse that Hitler and other extreme groups would use to strum up hate for the Weimar government. I think that ultimately the Treaty of Versailles was a fitting end to World War I. It was mismanaged and devastating, not just for the people at the time, but for generations to come. So it really does just put the cherry on top of what is, in my view, one of the worst events in all of world history. Historian Peter Hart does a nice job of summarizing how the Great War and the Treaty of Versailles and all of it put together is just an enduring stain on the human legacy. So I'll end this particular episode with a quote from him. Quote, "Unfortunately, it was not, it never was, a war to end wars, and the Great War proved an efficient catalyst in sowing the seeds for the numerous conflicts which have disfigured human history ever since. Within 21 short years, the world would be at war again. In many ways, the Second World War set terrible new benchmarks for horror. Yet somehow a more potent folk memory of the Great War lingers still. Even now, all the last active participants have died. The sense of tragedy, of futility, of a slaughter of the innocents, these sentiments still pervade our popular culture. There is a widespread vision of humanity dragged down from the sunny uplands into the morass. The Great War still resonates deeply even today. The decimation of a generation is not forgotten." Okay, so as always, thanks for listening. I haven't really given an update on the podcast in quite a while. I try to keep the post-podcast yakety yak to a minimum, as you know, but I do just want to say thank you for listening. It seemed that a lot of people have enjoyed the World War I stuff. Again, it wasn't really meant to be a full analysis or a chronological summary of the whole war by any stretch, just kind of my thoughts as the years go on, year by year throughout the war. It's been really cool to get a lot of interaction from you guys, from email, just offering some feedback on the podcast. That's been awesome to read and interact with you guys, which is great. I'm probably done with World War I for a while. I do have some new topics coming up, and I'm excited to get to those, so you can look forward to that if you're still listening. If you are still listening, again, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do that. It's awesome. If you do want to support the podcast, you can leave a rating, review on iTunes, subscribe on whatever place you're listening it to on, tell a friend, send me an email. All of those things are great. So until next time, again, thanks for listening, and that's it for me.